It was a slow Tuesday night at Joe's Diner, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. The walls were lined with faded pictures of better days, old cars, smiling families, and a shiny diner that once buzzed with energy. Now, the diner was quieter, almost forgotten by the outside world. The regulars sat in their usual spots, hunched over steaming cups of coffee that hadn't been refilled in a while, lost in their own thoughts. Strangers rarely stopped by, and that was just fine with the people who did. Emily Dawson moved quietly between the tables, her sneakers barely making a sound on the worn-out checkered floor. She carried a tray with 2 plates of pancakes balanced perfectly on one hand. Her apron was tied neatly around her waist, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Everything about her said she didn't want to stand out. She spoke only when she had to, and when she did, her voice was soft, almost shy. "Anything else for you?" she'd ask, her eyes not quite meeting theirs. Most people barely looked at her long enough to answer. She was just the waitress, after all. Nothing more. To the regulars, Emily was part of the background, like the faded jukebox in the corner that nobody played anymore. She had been working there for only a few months, but even that felt like forever in a place where nothing ever changed. "Good kid," old Mr. Billings said once, watching her clear a table. "Doesn't talk much, but she's a hard worker." "She's quiet, that's for sure," added Mrs. Daniels, another regular, as she sipped her tea. "Too quiet, maybe. Makes you wonder what she's hiding." It wasn't a mean comment, just idle curiosity. Emily didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. She kept to herself, her gaze low, always moving like she had somewhere to be. But Emily wasn't just quiet. She was watchful. While others saw a shy waitress, Emily saw everything. She noticed how Mr. Billings always stirred his coffee counterclockwise, how Mrs. Daniels liked her toast cut diagonally, and how the cook, Jerry, always checked the clock when he thought no one was looking, counting the minutes until his shift ended. She saw it all, but she never said a word. Nobody knew much about her, not even her co-workers. Jerry once asked where she was from, but all she said was, "Just passing through." The others didn't push. Emily didn't invite questions, and in a small town like this, people learned not to pry too much. Besides, what could a young woman like her have to hide? She was probably just trying to make ends meet, like everyone else. But Emily's silence wasn't just shyness. It was practice. Behind her calm demeanor, there was a story no one would believe if she told them. A story she carried with her every day, locked tight behind the walls she had built around herself. It wasn't that she wanted to keep secrets, it was that she had to. And most days, it wasn't hard. Joe's Diner was the perfect place to blend in, where people asked for extra syrup but never asked about your past. Tonight, though, was different. Something was in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. The diner felt heavier somehow, the hum of the fluorescent lights louder than usual. Emily noticed it the moment she walked in for her shift. She tied her apron a little tighter than usual and glanced around. Everything seemed normal, but Emily had learned long ago to trust her instincts. They had saved her life more times than she cared to count. Tonight, they told her to be ready. For what, she didn't know. "Emily, table 4 needs coffee," Jerry called from the kitchen, snapping her out of her thoughts. She nodded and grabbed the pot, her fingers steady as she poured. If anyone noticed how her eyes flicked toward the windows every so often, they didn't say anything. But Emily noticed everything, every shadow outside, every sound that didn't belong. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. It was barely 8 p.m., but it felt much later. The regulars were quiet tonight, and the empty booth seemed to stretch on forever. Emily wiped down the counter for the 3rd time, even though it didn't need it. She had always been good at keeping herself busy, at looking like she belonged. But deep down, she knew she didn't. Not really. Before the diner, before this town, Emily had lived a very different life. A life of danger and adrenaline, of choices that didn't leave room for mistakes. She had learned to stay calm under pressure, to think 5 steps ahead, and to move like a ghost when it mattered most. That life had shaped her, molded her into someone who could handle anything. But it had also made her a target. Emily shook her head, pushing the memories away. That was another life, one she had left behind. Or so she thought. A low rumble reached her ears, growing louder by the second. The sound of engines, several of them, cutting through the stillness of the night. Emily's hand tightened on the coffee pot, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't turn to look, but she didn't have to. She already knew. The rumble stopped as the engines were cut, and then came the unmistakable sound of boots hitting pavement. Laughter, loud and rough, followed. Emily placed the coffee pot back on the burner, her movements smooth and unhurried. She could feel the tension in the room shift, the regulars turning toward the windows with wary eyes. The door swung open, the bell jingling loudly. 5 men walked in, filling the small diner with their presence. Leather jackets, heavy boots, tattoos snaking up their arms. They moved like they owned the place, their voices booming as they laughed and shoved each other. Emily didn't flinch. She kept her gaze down, her hands steady as she grabbed a menu and walked toward them. Her heart was calm now, her breathing even. She had been in situations like this before. She knew how to handle them. The leader of the group, a tall man with a shaved head and a cocky grin, leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning the diner before landing on Emily. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Aren't you a quiet little thing? Emily stopped a few feet away, holding out the menu without looking at him. Table or counter, she asked, her voice steady but soft. The man chuckled, taking the menu but not sitting down. You don't talk much, do you? He said, leaning closer. Emily didn't answer. She didn't have to. This wasn't her first time dealing with men like him. And if he pushed her too far, it wouldn't be his last mistake. Tonight, the past she had tried so hard to leave behind was about to catch up with her. And when it did, the quiet waitress at Joe's diner would be the last thing anyone saw coming. The peaceful hum of Joe's diner shattered as the sound of roaring motorcycle engines filled the air. It was the kind of noise that turned heads, even from across the parking lot. The engines growled loudly, cutting through the usual quiet of the small town like a storm rolling in. People inside the diner froze, their conversations halting mid-sentence as 5 bikes pulled up, one after the other. The bikers climbed off their motorcycles, boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. They were loud even before they stepped inside, their laughter sharp and rough like they wanted everyone to hear them. They moved with the kind of confidence that said they owned the place like nothing and no one could stand in their way. Their leather jackets were patched with symbols, their boots scuffed from years of wear. They looked dangerous, the kind of men who didn't care about rules. When the door swung open, the little bell above it jingled, but it was drowned out by the noise of the bikers. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard, stepped in first. He grinned widely, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for someone to challenge him. The other 4 followed close behind, each of them laughing and talking loudly. They filled the small diner with their presence, their voices bouncing off the walls. Emily was at the counter, pouring coffee into an old man's cup. She didn't flinch, didn't even look up, as the bikers stomped past her. She simply finished pouring, gave the man a quick nod, and turned to put the coffee pot back on the burner. The leader of the group glanced around the diner, his grin growing as he spotted an empty booth in the corner. "This'll do," he said, motioning for his friends to follow him. They didn't sit quietly. Instead, they shoved each other as they slid into the booth, their voices louder than the low hum of the jukebox that played in the background. Emily picked up her notepad and walked toward them, her step steady and calm. Her sneakers didn't make a sound against the floor, and her face showed no emotion. She stopped just short of their booth and stood there, waiting. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. "What's with the service here?" one of the bikers asked, leaning back in the booth. He had a toothpick hanging from the corner of his mouth, and he twirled it lazily. "You don't say hello? No smile? Nothing?" Emily raised her notepad, her pencil poised. "What can I get you?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The leader smirked, leaning forward so his elbows rested on the table. "What's on the menu, sweetheart?" Emily pointed to the laminated menu already sitting on their table. "Everything's listed there," she said, her voice calm and even. The bikers laughed, the sound loud and mocking. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" the leader said, looking at her closely. "Bet you don't talk much. Don't smile much either. What's the matter? Too shy? She looks like she couldn't lift a plate, let alone handle real work," one of the others added, his voice dripping with mockery. The rest of the table burst into laughter, their voices carrying across the diner. Emily didn't react. She stood still, her face unreadable, and waited for their orders. Her pencil didn't move, and her hands didn't shake. The leader finally waved his hand. "Fine, fine. We'll take some burgers. Fries. And bring us coffee, lots of it. You can do that, can't you?" Emily nodded once and turned to leave without a word. As she walked away, the bikers kept talking, their voices louder than necessary. "What do you think her deal is?" one of them asked. "Think she's scared of us?" "Probably," another answered with a grin. "Most people are." "Yeah, she's not gonna last in this job," the leader added. "Too soft. Too quiet." Behind the counter, Emily filled their coffee cups. Her movements were smooth and steady, her hands sure as she worked. She didn't glance in their direction, but she could feel their eyes on her. It wasn't the first time she had dealt with people like this. She knew how to handle them by not reacting. When she brought their coffee to the table, she placed the cups down gently, one by one. She didn't spill a drop. The bikers watched her closely, waiting for her to slip up, to show some sign of fear or nervousness. But Emily didn't give them that satisfaction. "Hey," one of them called as she turned to leave. "You forgot the cream and sugar. What kind of waitress doesn't know how to do her job?" Emily stopped, then turned back. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a handful of sugar packets and small containers of cream. She placed them on the table without a word. The biker grinned. "Oh, so you can listen," he said. "Good girl." The table erupted in laughter again. Emily walked away, her face calm and unreadable, but her co-workers were starting to glance nervously at the scene. Jerry, the cook, peeked out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He caught Emily's eye and gave her a small nod, as if to say, "You okay?" Emily nodded back. She was fine. But the bikers weren't done. They kept testing her, pushing her patience with their loud remarks and crude jokes. One of them snapped his fingers at her, waving an empty coffee cup in the air. Another threw a napkin on the floor and waited to see if she would pick it up. Emily didn't react to any of it. She moved with the same calm efficiency, refilling their cups and clearing their plates without a word. The regulars watched nervously, their conversations hushed. Mr. Billings leaned toward Mrs. Daniels. "She's handling it pretty well, don't you think?" "She is," Mrs. Daniels whispered back. "But for how long?" Emily's co-workers stayed near the counter, whispering to each other. "They're really pushing her," one of them said. "Should we call someone? Maybe the manager." "She's got it," Jerry said quietly. "Just, stay ready." Emily, meanwhile, moved like nothing was wrong. She wiped down tables, refilled drinks, and kept the coffee pot full. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something different. Her movements were too calm, too controlled. It was the kind of calm that came from practice, the kind that came before a storm. And the storm was coming. The bikers didn't know it yet, but they were pushing the wrong person. As the night went on, the bikers grew louder, their laughter echoing off the walls of Joe's diner. What started as simple taunts and rude comments had turned into something more deliberate. They weren't just making noise anymore, they were testing limits, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go. One of them, a stocky man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned back in his chair and crumpled a napkin into a ball. With a smirk, he tossed it onto the floor near Emily's feet as she walked past. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You missed a spot. Why don't you clean that up for me?" Emily stopped, her hands full with a tray of empty plates she'd just cleared from another table. She glanced at the napkin but didn't move to pick it up. Instead, she raised her eyes just enough to meet his gaze for a brief moment. It was only a second, but it was enough to make the man falter slightly. There was something in her look, steady, calm, and unshaken. Without a word, she turned and walked away, carrying the tray back to the counter. The man snorted, trying to cover up his discomfort. "What's the matter?" "Too good to do your job," he muttered, but Emily didn't respond. At the counter, Emily set the tray down and took a deep breath. Her face remained composed, her expression blank, but inside, she was alert. She felt the tension in the room growing, and her mind was already running through possibilities. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. She had faced far worse than a few loud bikers in a quiet diner. But she knew how quickly things could escalate, and she needed to be ready. When she returned to the bikers' table with a fresh pot of coffee, another one of them decided to push her further. This one was younger, his face still boyish under the scruff of a poorly grown beard. As she leaned over to pour coffee into his cup, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. The grip wasn't hard, but it was firm enough to make his intentions clear. "Hey," he said, grinning up at her. "Why don't you take a break and sit with us? We don't bite much." Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she looked down at his hand on her wrist, her expression still calm. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and quiet. "Let go," she said simply. The young biker hesitated, surprised by the firmness in her tone. For a moment, he seemed unsure. Then, with a shrug, he let go, laughing nervously. "Relax, I was just joking," he said, looking to his friends for backup. The others laughed, though it felt forced, as if even they sensed the shift in the air. Emily poured the coffee without spilling a drop, then turned and walked away, leaving the group to their uneasy chuckles. If anyone in the diner had been paying close attention, they might have noticed something different about Emily. It wasn't just that she stayed calm in the face of their taunts, it was the way she moved, the way she carried herself. Her steps were quiet but deliberate, her body balanced as if ready for anything. She didn't fidget or falter, and her eyes were constantly scanning the room, taking in every detail. She noticed how the bikers sat, how they positioned themselves at the booth. She noted which one seemed to lead the group, the tall one with the beard, and which ones followed his lead. She saw the way their jackets hung open, revealing flashes of metal at their waists. Pocket knives, maybe, or something more serious. Emily filed the information away in her mind, just in case. Her co-workers, meanwhile, were growing more nervous. Behind the counter, Jerry, the cook, wiped his hands on his apron for the 5th time in as many minutes. "You think we should call the sheriff?" he whispered to one of the waitresses. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Carol, shook her head. "Not yet. They haven't done anything, well, not anything serious. Let's wait and see." "Wait and see?" Jerry hissed. What if it gets out of hand? Carol glanced toward Emily, who was calmly refilling a customer's water glass. She seems to have it under control, Carol said, though there was doubt in her voice. She's different, you know. I don't think they scare her. Jerry frowned, watching as Emily moved back toward the biker's table. Yeah, he muttered. That's what I'm worried about. Back at the table, the bikers were still trying to rile Emily up. The leader leaned back in his seat, watching her approach. You're a tough one, aren't you? He said, his tone half admiring, half mocking. Most girls would have run out of here crying by now. But not you. Emily didn't respond. She placed a plate of fries on the table and turned to leave, but the leader wasn't finished. Hey, he called after her. What's your story, huh? You're not from around here, are you? Emily paused, her back to the table. For a moment, it seemed like she might answer. But then she kept walking, disappearing behind the counter without a word. The bikers exchanged looks. What's with her? One of them muttered. She's weird. Yeah, the young one agreed. Creepy, almost. The leader smirked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He glanced toward the counter, where Emily was now wiping down the coffee machine. Her movements were smooth and practiced, her expression unreadable. She's hiding something, he said quietly, almost to himself. I can feel it. If only he had known how right he was. Because Emily wasn't just calm, she was prepared. Her eyes tracked every movement in the room, noting how close the regulars were to the exits and where the bikers had parked their motorcycles. She could feel the weight of the small object in her pocket, a familiar tool she hoped she wouldn't have to use. She didn't want trouble. But if trouble came, she would be ready. For now, she stayed quiet, letting the bikers think they had the upper hand. It was better that way. They didn't need to know the truth, at least, not yet. But if they pushed her too far, they'd find out soon enough. And when they did, they'd regret ever stepping foot in Joe's diner. The diner's air grew heavier with every passing second, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers, now emboldened by their own noise and bravado, had taken over the small room, their laughter bouncing off the walls. The regulars sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between Emily and the gang. The staff huddled near the kitchen, whispering nervously, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. Jerry, the cook, stood by the phone, one hand hovering near it in case things spiraled out of control. At the center of it all stood Emily. She moved around the diner with quiet efficiency, her face calm and her eyes steady, as if the chaos surrounding her didn't exist. But inside, she was fully aware. Every step she took, every glance she made, was deliberate. She wasn't just walking, she was watching, calculating, readying herself for whatever came next. The leader of the bikers, a tall man with a thick beard and a leather jacket covered in patches, leaned back in his seat, his smirk growing wider. He had been eyeing Emily all night, trying to get under her skin with crude jokes and mocking remarks. But no matter what he or his friends did, Emily hadn't given them the reaction they were looking for. Her silence only seemed to irritate him more. Finally, he stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound made everyone in the diner flinch, but Emily didn't even blink. The leader took a step forward, blocking her path as she carried a tray of empty plates back to the counter. His grin was sharp, his eyes glinting with amusement. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Cat got your tongue." Emily stopped in her tracks, the tray balanced perfectly in her hands. For the first time all night, she looked up, her gaze locking with his. The room seemed to freeze, the tension crackling like electricity. The bikers stopped laughing, their attention now focused entirely on the exchange. Even the regulars held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. For a moment, Emily said nothing, her eyes studying the man in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and cold as ice. "Last chance," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "Leave now, before you regret it." The leader blinked, caught off guard by her tone. Then, he laughed a loud, booming sound meant to fill the room and mask his unease. "Regret it," he repeated, turning to his friends. "Did you hear that? Little Miss Waitress thinks she can tell us what to do." His friends laughed nervously, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. Something about the way Emily stood, the way she looked at their leader, didn't sit right with them. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. He stepped closer, towering over Emily. "And what are you gonna do, huh?" he taunted. "Throw a plate at me? Call the cops? You don't scare me." Emily didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply set the tray down on a nearby table, her movements slow and deliberate. Then, in one fluid motion, she reached out and grabbed the man's wrist. It happened so fast that no one had time to react. 1 second, the leader was standing tall, his grin firmly in place. The next, he was doubled over, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made him yelp in pain. Emily's grip was ironclad, her movements precise and efficient, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The room erupted into chaos. "Hey," one of the bikers shouted, jumping to his feet. He lunged toward Emily, but she was faster. With a quick sidestep, she shifted her weight and sent the leader stumbling into his friend, knocking them both to the floor. Another biker charged, his fists raised. Emily met him head-on, her movements a blur. She ducked under his swing and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. He groaned, clutching his ribs as he tried to catch his breath. The remaining two bikers hesitated, their confidence wavering as they watched their friends sprawled on the floor. One of them reached for something at his waist, a knife, maybe, but before he could draw it, Emily was on him. She grabbed his wrist and twisted, forcing him to drop the weapon. With a well-placed kick, she sent it skidding across the floor, far out of reach. The last biker, a younger man who had been the loudest earlier, held up his hands and backed away slowly. Hey, we don't want any trouble," he stammered, his voice shaking. "We're leaving, okay? We're leaving." Emily straightened, her breathing steady, and looked around the room. The leader was still on the floor, clutching his arm and glaring up at her with a mix of pain and disbelief. His friends were either groaning in defeat or scrambling to get up. "Delta Force," Emily said, her voice calm but cold. "Look it up." The room fell silent. The bikers stared at her, their bravado completely shattered. The regulars exchanged wide-eyed glances, the realization of who Emily really was sinking in. Even Jerry, who had been hovering near the phone, looked stunned. The leader struggled to his feet, his movements slow and stiff. He opened his mouth to say something, but Emily cut him off with a sharp look. "Take your friends and leave," she said firmly. "Now." Without another word, the leader nodded and motioned for his gang to follow. They stumbled out of the diner, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet humiliation. The sound of their motorcycles roaring to life echoed in the distance as they sped away. Emily stood in the middle of the diner, her expression unreadable. She adjusted her apron, picked up the tray she had set down earlier, and returned to the counter as if nothing had happened. The room remained silent for a moment longer before one of the regulars finally spoke. "Delta Force?" Mr. Billings asked, his voice tinged with awe. "You mean, like, the military?" Emily glanced at him, her lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "Something like that," she said, her tone light. Jerry let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." The rest of the diner erupted into murmurs, the tension finally breaking. The regulars started talking again, their voices filled with excitement and admiration. But Emily didn't linger. She simply went back to work, her movements as calm and composed as ever. Outside, the night was quiet once more. But inside Joe's diner, no one would ever look at the silent waitress the same way again. The loud wail of sirens cut through the night air as 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot of Joe's diner. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. Inside, the tension had dissolved, replaced by a heavy silence. All eyes were on the bikers, who now sat slumped in a booth, their earlier bravado completely gone. The leader, who had swaggered in with a grin and an air of invincibility, now looked pale and shaken. His right arm hung awkwardly at his side, and his eyes darted nervously between the door and Emily, who stood calmly behind the counter.